Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Deanna Minich. Welcome to this series of thought leader conversations around COVID-19. These are a series of talks that we're going to be having with experts, and this is sponsored by the American Nutrition Association. So our first expert today is Dr. David Perlmutter, who many of you already know and are aware of his work. He's a board-certified neurologist and a fellow of the American College of Nutrition. And he's written a lot about the gut, a lot about the brain. And so today we're going to have a conversation about mental hijacking, which I think will be a great topic for us to start off with, talking about the stress, the gut-brain effects of having this pandemic to confront. So welcome, Dr. Perlmutter.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let's start by first maybe defining what do we mean by mental hijacking during this time of COVID-19? What does that mean exactly?
Well, interestingly, our work on this whole concept of mental hijacking took place prior to the current events, but the current events are certainly playing into exactly the mechanisms that we described. And that is, we know that our attention is basically sold to the highest bidder. We know that where we spend our time online, for example, is really very valuable to others, and that our online experiences and even our daily experiences now are really significantly manipulated, again, not necessarily for our own personal benefit. It takes us really away from a place of being able to make thoughtful decisions and plan for the future, and tends to lock us more into a place of impulsivity. And that really means more fear-based decisions emanating from the part of the brain that we call the amygdala, a more primitive part of the brain. So the more we're exposed from media and social media and our digital experiences, the more we're exposed to fear-enhancing stimuli, the more it locks us into being much more impulsive, and the more it takes us away from the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that allows us to make decisions, for example, that think about the future, that think about more than just how the world will be tomorrow or in a week or 2 weeks, but making better long-term decisions and making decisions based upon things like empathy, for example. So, as we look around, there's a lot of worrisome press that we are exposed to. I think it's valuable to keep your ear to the ground and know what's going on around you, staying up with the latest information. But I think that we can certainly take it to an extreme where it does nothing more than fan the flames. And again, that will lock us in to impulsivity and short-sightedness. And we cannot afford to make only short-sighted decisions right now. We have to think about making decisions about the long-term outcome. Normally, we have to do that, and certainly now it's even more important.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and it's very well recognized that people are in states of everything from panic to low-level anxiety to not being able to sleep well, and all of this is reshaping, resculpting their brain matter, and that's changing essentially their decisions in the future.
That's right, and it becomes what we call a feed-forward cycle, meaning the more that we engage this information, and therefore the more that we compromise our ability to get a good night's sleep, the more that we just sort of give up on exercise and we stop thinking we need to eat appropriately. What does this do? It does a couple of things that are really quite worrisome. Number one, that inflammation caused by lack of sleep, lack of eating an appropriate diet, lack of exercise, lack of nature exposure, that inflammation locks us into more impulsive choice making. And that just keeps this going further and further. The other thing is, everything I just mentioned compromises immune function. And, it's been said that the best defense is a good offense. And that's coming from football. So if you can attack the opposing team with a good offense, you're in good shape. We don't have anything in the offensive department right now as it relates to COVID-19. We do not yet have any effective widespread treatment available, but yet we can certainly shore up our defenses. And what does that mean? It means doing the very best we can to enhance our immune function. That's our only line of defense. Immune function is strengthened by a good night's sleep, by less fear, by regaining our time in nature, by dedicating ourselves to exercise, and perhaps most importantly, by doubling down on all the good nutritional things we know that are helpful for us in terms of balancing the immune system, catering to our gut bacteria, and reducing inflammation.
So many great things in what you just said, and it really speaks to, when I think of the I's, inflammation, immunity, and impulsivity. And I recall that there was an article published, I believe it was PLOS ONE, not too long ago, I think just a couple of years ago, showing that when we have increased inflammation, it leads to greater impulsivity. And
That's right. And the study that you're referring to did something called delayed discounting, meaning they offered people in the study group either, let's say, $10 now, or if you would wait a month, you would get $100. At the beginning of the study, virtually everybody said, I'll wait, nothing wrong with waiting for a month. But when they showed them threatening pictures versus pictures, for example, of nature, there was a strong difference in the responses, whereby those people who were showed the threatening image were far less likely moving forward to be okay with delaying the gratification and became much more impulsive. So even exposure to nature helps tamp down impulsivity. We've seen similar studies done with a single night of sleep deprivation. The very next day, impulsivity is dramatically enhanced. And in fact, in one study, the activity of the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, the impulsivity center of the brain, was increased by 60% by simply not getting a good night's sleep. Now, what does that do? It leads to then moving forward, making worse decisions. It also dramatically that day is going to amp up inflammation and cortisol further amplifies inflammation because of the changes that it imparts on the gut bacteria. So these are powerful lifestyle choices that now more than ever are extremely valuable in terms of enhancing our defense and putting us in a position whereby perhaps even if we do contract this virus, our response will be more balanced and less likely to be an overwhelming inflammatory storm.
Yeah, all very good points. I like it that you're talking about sleep, things that are within some type of locus of our control. And what you're speaking to, a lot of that research reminds me of Dr. Matthew Walker's work, looking at how even one poor night of sleep can lead to social isolation the next day, making less eye contact, having different posture. Essentially our sleep and our sleeping habits really do change us.
Without a doubt. And, here we are talking ultimately, I guess, about nutrition, and we're talking about probably one of the most nutritious foods that we can consume, and that is a good night's sleep. Who knew? I mean, we can fast for days at a time and get into ketosis. That's actually probably pretty good for many of us. But you can't do that with sleep. Even one night of sleep deprivation dramatically compromises the ability of the brain to clear itself through what we call the glymphatic system. As mentioned, it augments inflammation, it compromises immunity, it increases cortisol, and it activates this part of the brain, this impulsive, self-centered fear center called the amygdala. And, there's enough going on right now around us to activate the amygdala that we don't need any extra activation from a poor night's sleep. So people need to really get their arms around the facts that they can be arbiters of a good night's sleep or not by watching television or having any kind of screen time in the evening. You're exposing yourself to blue light, which compromises your ability to make melatonin, compromises your ability to get a good night's sleep. So we really are strongly involved with recommending a whole lot of lifestyle changes, like limiting caffeine after 2 p.m., like thinking about, does afternoon exercise compromise your sleep, or are you better exercising in the morning? and certainly blue light, making your room colder if you have that ability, darker and more quiet. Now is the time more than ever that we've got to be super attentive to the quality and quantity of our sleep. And as you well point out, Dr. Matthew Walker, in his book, Why We Sleep, makes it abundantly clear, not only in his book, but in his ongoing research, that it is highly underrated. It is extremely important. And, you know, we don't eat for 8 hours a day. Most of us don't exercise for 8 hours a day, but we should be sleeping 7 to 8 hours a day. A third of our lives should be spent during this state where we are allowing repair to take place. And in these, dare I say, troubled times, it is one of the most valuable lifestyle choices that we can make.
It's so true. That said, I think the challenge for people is that they may be at home and lack a structure. So sleeping times might be off, waking times are off, children are at home. And so I'm wondering what your advisement would be as to how do we stay in the present moment and how do we stay apprised of what's happening at the large level so that we are informed but not panicked, and we can get our rhythm and we can have structure to our day and sleep well. So where is that happy balance? How do you do it?
Well, how do you get the structure? You build the structure. You find out what works for you as an individual. What is the personalized approach that works for you? Recognizing that your goals are to sleep well, to exercise, to maintain your ability to feed yourself and your family appropriately. I think that at the same time, we don't want to bury our heads in the sand and become totally ignorant about what's going on around us. There are good news sources that can provide us information, and unfortunately, or the way it is, that there is some politicizing of the news depending on what your source is. And I would say that one of the things we've talked about recently in our new book, Brainwash, is the idea to visit the other sources of news once in a while, to hear the viewpoints of other people, and to try to feel how that experience is treating you, as opposed to being extremely polarized, digging your heels in the sand, saying, I'm only going to listen to this one network, end of story. But I think it's about recognizing we're all living in a new reality. It's time to take a deep breath and embrace that, and then make the adjustments. This is actually, in many ways, a good time for people to reconnect to family members, to reconnect to others, although it may not be in person. Many people have extra time on their hands. It's time to clean out the closet, clean out the drawer, do all those things that you've been putting off. And other things that I'm finding personally to be very rewarding is growing vegetables, which I would not have normally done at this time of year in Florida, so it's a bit challenging. But that is something that everyone can do, even in an apartment. You can put a pot on the windowsill, grow some herbs if that's what you're able to do. But it is about reconnecting and also disconnecting. We want to reconnect with others, want to find the deep value in relationships. But at the same time, I think it's extremely important to disconnect from the media that is whipped things up into a frenzy. Some of that is necessary because this is a very, very severe event. We're only at the beginning of this right now. I know this is an evergreen time together that you and I have, but the point is it's going to certainly, by everyone's estimation, get much more intense. So I think the time to plant the seeds in terms of emotionally preparing for what is to come would be now, in recognizing we've got to adopt a new rhythm, and at the same time value the things we have talked about: sleep, proper diet, nutrition, exercise, and then, as you mentioned, the idea of staying in the present. Being able to stay in the present is something that is facilitated by meditation. That's what meditation is all about, is momentarily distancing yourself from what's happened earlier today or yesterday, distancing yourself from what I plan to do tomorrow, and for that brief moment, that 20 minutes, concentrating on your breath or a mantra or a prayer or whatever it is that can keep you in the present. By being in the present, you are creating a situation that allows you to make better connection to the prefrontal cortex, and as such, be in a better position then to make better decisions as they relate to the future, for better planning for what is to come, as opposed to not meditating, not getting good night's sleep, eating inappropriately. That tends to lock you into the fear-based impulsivity center of the brain called the amygdala. So meditation turns out to be an extremely valuable tool that we have here. And for most of us, I guess we have a little bit more time at home, so we can dedicate to that.
You've given us so many different modalities to pick from, and one of the ones that we support in alignment with those is nutrition at the American Nutrition Association. We've just recently released a position statement on personalized nutrition as it relates to this era of COVID-19. And what I'd like to do, you mentioned vegetables. You mentioned that you're starting to plant your own vegetables. I'd like for us to drill down a bit into how do we personalize nutrients and nutrition. You mentioned following a good, healthy dietary pattern. Let's give the listener some ideas as to what we could be thinking about, because I don't know about in Florida, but I know that in the Seattle area where I live, our produce section of the grocery store is still quite full. The processed food sections are quite empty. So perhaps you can navigate us a bit further as it relates to a personalized approach of nutrition during this era of COVID.
Deanna, you've just unpacked quite a lot of important points. And let me take one first that maybe you just said in passing, but I think it's really valuable. And that is that you've got lots of produce, but the packaged goods seem to be flying off the shelves. It just sort of it just typifies what the American diet is like. And it really makes us wonder why in areas of the world that have adopted a Western diet, why both the rates and the complications of this infection seem to be so much higher in comparison to sub-Saharan Africa, in comparison to places like Haiti and certain places in Central America that haven't yet really fully adopted our diet and other aspects of our lifestyle. I'm going to digress for just a moment because it speaks to, in my opinion, the role of dietary choices and hygiene as it relates to the gut bacteria, the microbiome. And, it's interesting that some of the areas that are least involved right now in terms of numbers of cases as well as morbidity are areas that have the least attention to hygiene, if you will, as opposed to Northern European countries, Scandinavian countries, and certainly North America, where hygiene is foremost. It takes us back to 1988 when Dr. Strachan explained how this notion of the hygiene hypothesis might have a role to play in how robust our immune systems are in terms of responding when our immune systems are called upon. And it really speaks to the fact that challenging the immune system early on in life with a less than hygienically perfect environment might actually be a good thing. And now when you look at where the cases are globally and how bad they are, we see the areas with what we would say are the least amount of attention to hygiene actually doing the best. These are areas of the world that have very high rates of parasitic infection, very high rates of helminth or worm infection in comparison to, for example, what we have here in America. And as you are well aware, there are actually interventions being done as it relates to worms, for example, putting whipworm eggs in individuals to balance their immune systems in individuals, for example, with autoimmune disease. Some of the pioneering work done by Dr. Sid Baker, for example. So it really takes us to the microbiome and its role in determining who gets and how bad they get as it relates to COVID-19. And that takes us back to your grocery store in Seattle, where the shelves seem to be devoid of processed, highly refined foods, and yet there seems still to be plenty of vegetables. Our food choices play a major role in determining the diversity and functionality of our gut bacteria. One of the primary roles of the gut microbiome is to balance the immune system and allow us to respond appropriately to immunological challenges. Number one. Number two, to balance the process of inflammation. So I think it's an interesting consideration when we recognize that there are all of these phenomena that seem to be relating to increased risk of a bad outcome. And by and large, what are they? They are chronic degenerative conditions. Let's list them. The number one associated chronic degenerative condition that is associated with a poorer outcome with respect to COVID-19 infection is cardiovascular disease, followed closely by other chronic degenerative conditions like type 2 diabetes, autoimmune conditions, cancer, etc. And by and large, these are conditions which relate very strongly to dietary choices. So in a very real way, when we connect these dots, we see that dietary choices may be responsible for why in our country we've seen an incredible explosion in both the number of cases and certainly not far behind will be the number of deaths. Right now, we're reaching the saturation point in terms of our ability to leverage our incredibly advanced hospitalization techniques to allow some of those people with bad responses to this infection to possibly survive. But even in the best of hands, in the United States, individuals going on a ventilator are about 70 to 75% likely to die. That's the numbers that are coming out, and it indicates that even with our most highly advanced technology, once people decline to that stage, in fact, most will perish from this infection. And what happens at the end is an inflammatory event. The colloquial term is the cytokine storm, but basically what it means is just a sudden explosion of the production of inflammatory mediators, predominantly interleukin-6, which is measurable and absolutely predicts the onset of this cytokine storm that is oftentimes the fatal event. So it really brings us back to something that those of us, yourself included, for years have been talking about, and that is, how does the human body limit excessive inflammation, both acutely and chronically? And we know that diet is on the top of the list in terms of how our bodies are able to deal with inflammation. It would be great if we could do correlative studies on individuals who are hospitalized versus those who are not hospitalized with COVID-19 infection and measure certain things like omega-3 levels, DHA levels in particular, vitamin D levels, zinc levels, etc. Because while these are all being talked about in the context of inflammation, we don't have data that will allow us to say, here we can definitely prove that having had a higher vitamin D level was an effective way to reduce the likelihood of a severe inflammatory event with this infection. We have to look at data that explains, for example, how vitamin D modulates inflammation by binding to certain receptors, how it enhances the production of antimicrobial peptides like cathelicidin D, and how these antimicrobial peptides are effective in quenching a viral infection, for example. How zinc works in similar ways to reduce inflammation, to reduce presence of virus or activity. But we don't have the specific correlative studies as it relates to this current infection. It would not be hard to do. It would be simply drawing blood specimens. I mean, in my ideal world, we'd be doing sequencing of gut bacteria as patients are admitted in comparison to age-matched controls, and trying to determine what are these, if there are indeed any, if I'm right, what are the perturbations of the microbiome that seem to be associated with worse outcome. But that said, what is clear, what comes to us from the Chinese data early on, is that those individuals with underlying chronic disease, including obesity, I might add, having a BMI over 40 is associated with dramatic increased risk of dying from this infection. These are chronic situations that are by and large brought about by lifestyle choices. So it really does amplify the importance of our discussion right now in terms of nutrition. Now, I know this is a long answer. If you want to interrupt me anytime, please feel free. But I want to get back to the question about personalized medicine. And this is an answer I think that would probably surprise you. And I'm going to tell you that as I think this through, I believe that right now, with all due respect, is not necessarily the time to think about personalized nutrition. As we look at the nuances of personalized nutrition, we are talking about constructing specific nutritional recommendations based upon the requirements of the individual. That's why it's called personalized. Whether it's looking at that individual's underlying disease processes or their sequencing of their gut bacteria, or even looking at their genetic sequencing, that's what personalized medicine is all about, or personalized nutrition in this case. I think right now, it's important to back away from that, in my opinion, and look at the broad strokes. And because I don't think we are in a position right now of being able to apply the metrics to individuals to provide them a personalized recommendation. Having said that, what are those broad strokes? And I think it's really the things that we've been talking about in this community for a long time. And that is, what are the broad stroke recommendations that will help balance the immune system, that will cater to the functionality and the happiness of our gut bacteria, and help reduce inflammation? And the simple broad strokes are dramatic reduction in sugar, dramatic reduction in refined carbohydrates, welcoming colorful, fibrous vegetables back to the table, limiting our exposure to things like, for example, chlorinated water, and certainly wanting to give our nutritional supplements an overview right now, again, with the broad stroke recommendations, looking at things like adding a dietary fiber, prebiotic fiber supplement, perhaps a good probiotic, perhaps some extra zinc and vitamin D, and certainly, in my opinion, a good source of DHA. All focused on the notion of balancing the immune system, perhaps some antiviral activity, and certainly catering to the gut bacteria. Now, if we want to take it a little bit further and a little bit more in depth, I would say a little bit more technical would be looking at ways that we can amplify a pathway that is strongly related to quenching free radicals that can be amplified during a viral infection, and strongly related to balancing and reducing excessive inflammation. Now, that pathway is called the NRF2 pathway, and there are many ways to activate NRF2. Using cruciferous vegetables, broccoli sprouts, chewing broccoli seeds, making sure we chew them to activate this chemical called sulforaphane, or to make it transformed from glucoraphanin, coffee, tea, green tea, physical exercise, even caloric restriction, many ways, resveratrol, many ways, turmeric, to activate this NRF2 pathway and help calm inflammation. There is some preliminary data indicating that, for example, curcumin, which we would get from consuming turmeric, might help actually in this so-called cytokine storm. The study, however, indicated that it would probably take intravenous administration of turmeric to achieve the level that was demonstrated in vitro to have a profound effect specifically on interleukin-6. But those broad stroke recommendations are the things that I want to amplify these days. As you know, I'm all in as it relates to personalized medicine, looking at all the nuances that we can bring to bear for each person. But I think right now we've got to concentrate on the big picture. What are the broad stroke recommendations for everyone? And now is absolutely not the time to default back to the comfort foods in terms of creating the best defense possible.
Lots of incredible tips, tidbits, and as you mentioned, brushstrokes that I think for public health recommendations that all of us in some way can connect into. You mentioned everything. So just to do a quick recap for everybody, thinking about, we talked about sleep, meditation, talking about being in nature. It was really nice to hear you talk about really reconnecting with nature, getting out, walking, getting fresh air, getting physical activity, and you gave a number of different nutrients to be thinking about. So omega-3s, especially DHA, zinc, vitamin D, colorful fruits and vegetables, absolutely, getting those dietary fibers. So I think I really like what you're saying about we need to go big and broad at this time. We need to be looking at public health measures. And I'm hoping, as you probably are as well, that people get inspired during this time. Like, what could be the best, biggest lesson of all of this for us? How can we engage more with our health? How can we get more personalized? How can we seek out practitioners to actually follow through and to help us to understand our individual biochemistry and physiologies a bit better? So thank you, Dr. Perlmutter. This has been an astounding, just a great kickoff to a series of these different talks that we'll be doing with the ANA. And so any final comments for our viewers before we close?
Sure. First, let me thank you for this opportunity. And thank you for putting this together. I know you and Meredith were so deeply involved in creating this. And I think that at the end of the day, I want to say we're going to get through this. We really will. And I think it's going to turn out to be a wonderful learning experience for all of us. You know, we think back, oh, what was it like in 1918? What was it like in World War II? How did our parents and this and that? And you know, we're in that situation. You know, we're not the greatest generation, according to Tom Brokaw. That was the World War II generation. But now we're being challenged. We're having to step up to the plate. And I think that we're going to get through it. We're going to be innovative. We're going to be dynamic, which I think is really important as we learn new things to be able to shift our position and our recommendations. So I think the positive will be a learning experience for everyone.
Absolutely. So staying present, focusing on the positive, and thinking about how our world will never be the same. We are going to see lots of shifts. And so again, thank you, Dr. Perlmutter. Thank you for giving us a reset on all things mental health, really looking at how media might be changing our brain. And so really appreciate you giving us the big picture as well as some tactical things that we can do on an everyday basis. Thanks again.
You bet. See you soon.